How you structure chapters can keep your reader engrossed in the story. But what makes a good chapter? Although the term good is often subjective when reading a book, there are some things that tend to work best when writing. Hello, I'm Mike with WriterSanctuary, and in this week of Reedsy Master Class for How to Write a Novel, Tom Bromley delivered methods in which to write a good chapter. Now, day one was chapters as a whole. How they work, how they shape a story, and ways that sentences and paragraphs within each has a defining point. According to Patricia Highsmith, author of well-known works such as The Talented Mr. Ripley, a chapter-by-chapter outline is ideal when writing fiction. Personally, I outline the entire book as a whole, mostly so I can remember what the hell I want to write. The memory isn't as sharp nowadays. The point, though, is that not to ramble aimlessly through a chapter without having a point. Chapters are also most about events in chronological order. Instead of A to B to C, sometimes they go from A to C to B to D, and then back to A. Of course, that really depends on how you're structuring your book. But if it's done well, it can work. And what's the best length for a chapter? Well, it is relevant to what is happening. There is no absolute best length, as it truly comes down to the scenes within it. Chapters can often range anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 words depending on what's going on in the story. Lastly, don't be afraid to break up the story with parts containing several chapters. Personally, I'm not sure if I'll ever use this technique, but I can see how some people might, especially on much bigger books. Now, day 2 focused on the beginnings and endings of your chapter. Now, one thing a lot of authors practice is getting to the action as quickly as possible and then ending the chapter on a cliffhanger. I try to do cliffhangers as often as possible. In fact, I enjoy writing them as much as using misdirection. And if you listen to any of the Despair series, I do cliffhangers quite often. But closed endings of a chapter reduces the need for the reader to continue, as they don't have the mindset of wanting to know what happens next. In fact, one of my favorite things to hear from other people who are reading or listening to the books is, how the hell could you end it there? Lastly, always keep in mind how the beginning and ending of a chapter link up. Remember, as I mentioned in an earlier video, continuity is vital to a story. This includes making sure all elements of the book are connected in some way, and this includes how you start and end each chapter. You want everything to make sense. On day 3, Tom Bromley explained how the lengths of a chapter work. How long should your chapters be? As I said, there's no right or wrong answer. It all comes down to the story, how you structure its flow, and the rhythm for which you're aiming. Like sentences and paragraphs, a long chapter shows a pace, while a shorter one quickens it. For instance, I have a chapter in my next book, Fury, that is around 10,000 words at the moment. This is in contrast to several chapters that are around the 3,500 word mark in between it, or on either side of it. Now, the reason why that one chapter is so long is because it's very character-driven, and it's the first engagement between the protagonist and the antagonist. Bottom line is that there is a lot going on, and I want the reader to absorb the details as they are pertinent going forward. Not to mention the sheer volume of characters that are in it. Think of Endgame from Avengers. Now, short chapters, on the other hand, are used for a quicker read, and they create a type of pressure to include plot points if you want them to make sense. So if you have a much shorter chapter, you have to condense as many plot points in it as humanly possible, otherwise it's just rambling. But one thing to keep in mind is how having a regular length of chapter for your book creates a good rhythm for the reader. As I said, with Fury, the longer chapter is done for a specific reason. The rest of them are roughly about the same size. Now, day 4 centered around ways to structure longer chapters. Now, a longer chapter is usually meant as a slower burn to allow readers to absorb everything that's going on. When writing longer chapters, you should focus on internal structure and how the entire length is broken down. Now, there are plenty of ways to do this, such as using timestamps, but not in the literal sense. Now, you can start a scene at like 7:42 a.m. and then start the next one at like 10:30 a.m., but that is completely up to you and what you're writing about. I'm talking about things that aren't quite as literal. For instance, a timestamp could be simply starting a section of text that happened on a Monday while the next one is on a Wednesday. Now, to break up longer chapters, I often use scene breaks or spaced paragraphs depending on what's happening. Like the vast majority of that 10,000 word chapter I mentioned earlier is of one scene. So I use double spaced paragraphs in order to give the reader a chance to recognize that there's something else going on, and then I start off with a different character. It's from his or her point of view, and then probably write another, I don't know, maybe 1,000 words, and then it shifts to a different point of view. So there's a lot going on in that particular chapter. But in that case, I don't use the scene breaks. Now, the bottom line is that you don't want the longer chapters to feel void of anything meaningful for the story. If not structured well, it can feel too long and drawn out, which could make for a very boring read. Now on day 5, Tom Bromley provided an example of pulling all of the elements of chapters together and how they work in an actual book. In this instance, he used Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers. Now the layout of the book is quite interesting, and it's brilliant how she structured chapters to drive the story forward. So I'm going to give you a bit of a spoiler alert for this book, so if you want to read it on your own, probably skip the next 20 seconds or so. Now, Claire Chambers starts the book with a newspaper article that essentially breaks down the ending of the book. It's set 6 months in the future, but you're not really sure about that until you start reading through the story. Now, in my next book, I kind of went the opposite direction and set the story in motion 20 years in the past. However, both methods could work exceptionally well if done right, as they create intrigue and curiosity as to what happens to get from point A to point B and back again. Now, on Saturday, the author interviews centered around research. I love hearing how other authors put their books together, and it's no wonder why many of us joke about being on a watch list somewhere, especially those of us who dive into horror and crime-centric genres. Even in a fantasy world you build on your own, there might be times for extensive research. In Kingmaker, there's a scene toward the end where I spent the better part of 3 days researching the maximum travel distance of a thoroughbred horse. And for the new book, I've spent a great deal of time researching elements of 1874 in Atlantic City, which is more difficult than you might think. Comparing Google Maps to drawings of the area, the firepower of the era, clothing, sights, and smells, it's a lot to look for. And not every element is forthcoming. Some things I've had to paint a bit with a fictional brush to make it seem realistic while missing certain details. As I said in a previous video, I don't have a DeLorean to travel back in time to check out Atlantic City in 1874. This week had a lot of great points to it in terms of chapter development. Some of it I already knew, and some of it will give me something to consider for future books. In fact, the example in Friday's video gave me ideas for the Wattpad fanfic that I plan on writing this year for how it will be structured in terms of chapters. But let's finish the other 4 before I decide to write something else, shall we? Nonetheless, this week's information was well delivered and very useful. Next week, though, we're tackling plot points 2, and I'm really looking forward to those lessons because we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into some of the things that I wouldn't say that I have trouble with, but some of the things that I am curious if there's a better way to do. For instance, one of the lessons next week is about group scenes, and that might be worthwhile simply because of that massive chapter I told you about in Fury that has a lot of characters in it. There's a lot going on, so really looking forward to seeing that video. But anywho, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. For more videos about self-publishing, blogging, freelance writing, or anything else I cover, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. I think it's going to do it for me today. I got to get back to writing. I'll see you next time.